What is up, what is up, what is up? Welcome to another episode of the Mitch Davis Show. I'm your host, Mitch Davis, founder of the MitchDavisShow.com, podcast host of the Mitch Davis Show, co-host of the Hit It to Hoover SEC Baseball podcast with Jake Nichols. You can follow me on Twitter, MitchDavis_8. Check out the website, themitchdavisshow.com. Got bowl coverage from cover to cover, from sea to sea. It is bowl season at the Mitch Davis Show. And on today's podcast, going to be joined by the voice of the Iowa Hawkeyes, Mr. Gary Dolphin will be joining me momentarily to talk all things Iowa football ahead of the Hawkeyes matchup with the Kentucky Wildcats in the 2022 Trans-Perfect Music City Bowl. Thank you for listening to the Mitch Davis Show. I am joined now by the voice of the Iowa Hawkeyes, a man that is a legend in Iowa Hawkeyes athletics. I mean, he's been around for a long time, Mr. Gary Dolphin. Mr. Gary, how you doing? Welcome on the Mitch Davis Show, and are you enjoying that blizzard there in Iowa?
Yeah, good morning. Good day, Mitch. Good to be on with you. It's December in Iowa. As the farmers like to say, if you don't like the weather right now, wait a minute. It'll change, and it usually does. But temperature's been dropping like an anchor here for the last few hours. But it is what it is. We're just bunker in. They're not advising travel. I'm okay with that. Hawkeye basketball is done for roughly 10 days, and I can just focus now on the bowl game that lies straight ahead with the Kentucky Wildcats. It's kind of ironic. Iowa started the year with Kentucky, and they're going to end the year with Coach Stoops and the blue of Kentucky. And I look for a very similar game. A very close game, I guess, similar to the Citrus Bowl in Orlando on New Year's Day. If for no other reason, brand new quarterbacks. Nobody knows what we're getting with either team's quarterbacks. That's the state of the game today. Guys leave, guys jump in the transfer portal, guys declare early for the NFL drafts. It's a different era of college football, but it's all good.
I want to ask you about that quarterback situation at Iowa. Obviously, everybody knows the injury to the starting quarterback. Transfer portal hit the second string guy, and now you're down to a freshman and another underclassman. What do you expect to see out of this offensive unit for Iowa when they play next Saturday against Kentucky?
Spencer Petras got hurt in the Nebraska game, had shoulder surgery, torn labrum, so he's out for, he won't be able to throw for a few months. And then the backup, Alex Padilla, jumped into the transfer portal right after the season. I'm sure that had already been planned by Alex. He wasn't counting on Spencer getting hurt, but he wants to find a new school, and I think he's one now of a dozen Hawkeyes that have been sitting in that transfer portal. There's over 1,000 kids in the transfer portal right now, and only 100, 120 of them have found new homes. That's just the way it is in college football nowadays. And when you combine the NIL product with guys eligible to leave and declare out for the bowl game because they're focusing on the NFL, like Will Levis at Kentucky, then you're saddled with what the situation is. Kentucky's going to start a kid that probably hasn't played more than a few snaps. Same thing for Iowa. In fact, both of Iowa's eligible quarterbacks, redshirt freshman Joey Labus and a pure freshman, Carson May, who's from Oklahoma. He just got on campus in June. So, I suspect that they'll go with Joey Labus based on what I've seen and heard in and around the team. I'll know more, obviously, the few days leading up to the bowl game when the Hawkeyes get to Nashville for their practices. But I would expect them to start Joey Labus. He had a really good spring a year ago when he was redshirting. He ran all the scout teams. So he's a bright kid. He's been in the program for going on 2 years, and he certainly should know the playbook by now. He's a kid out of the Cleveland area, where Ricky Stanzi was from a few years ago, same neighborhood. And he's really gifted skill-wise. He's about 6'3", about 220 pounds. He's more of an RPO. They'll get him out of the pocket and on the run. But how effective he'll be, never having played against a quality Power 5 opponent, let alone one with a really good defense. And Kentucky has an outstanding defense again. I suspect that they'll go a lot to the tight ends. That is Iowa's bread and butter in the passing game. Sam Laporte meniscus in the Minnesota game toward the end of the year. Had it scoped. He's good to go. He's back. He's ready to go. He had 53 catches this season. Led Iowa in pass catches. He was voted the top tight end in the Big Ten. He'll be a favorable, attractive draft pick for somebody. I mean, given Iowa's history with the tight end position. And then the kid that's emerged throughout the year is the tailback, Caleb Johnson. He has really shown his stuff. He's from near Cincinnati, Hamilton, Ohio, and he really runs with authority. He's a big kid. He's probably 6'1", maybe 215 pounds, and he had a breakout pure freshman season. He was on the depth chart to start the year, but that was about it. And then Gavin Williams, the starting tailback, got hurt in fall camp, never really played much at all this year because of the effectiveness of Caleb Johnson. He's broken off a couple touchdown runs in the 60 to 70-yard range. So I expect that they'll feed him the ball a lot, try and control the clock, move the chains, get scores where they can. They've got an All-American kicker in Keith Duncan who can reach the goalpost from anywhere 55 yards on end. So, will it be a conservative game plan like we're used to seeing out of the Hawkeyes? Only time will tell. But those are my views, at least a few days out from the bowl game.
You mentioned that the defensive side of the ball for both Kentucky and Iowa. How big of a factor is that defensive unit? I think that's probably the elephant in the room. Will the game be won on the defensive side of the ball?
I think so. I mean, Iowa's been a turnover takeaway defense for many, many years, going back to when Kurt arrived and Phil Parker was his defensive coordinator then. He is now. I mean, they've blossomed. They really coach up young guys that come into the program that have very few offers. I think of Chad Greenway and Aaron Campman and Jared DeVries, all these guys that played in the NFL for a long, long time. Bob Sanders, former NFL Defensive Player of the Year with the Colts, won a Super Bowl. I think he had 2 offers coming out of Erie, Pennsylvania. So they pick guys. I guess the bottom line, Mitch, is they pick guys for their system. They usually find guys that are multiple position players in high school. They're team captains. They're really good academically. They're smart guys, and obviously they grow them into big, tough, physical guys. And there's no more finer example of that than middle linebacker Jack Campbell. He's Iowa's 29th unanimous consensus All-America. He is the real deal. What's amazing about Campbell is his size and how he can move for 6'5", 247 pounds. I think he was when they last weighed him. He's an incredible athlete. Was a great high school basketball player in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and he's blended all of those talents into the best middle linebacker in the country. He was the winner of the Campbell, no relation, the Campbell Academic Scholar Athlete Award a few weeks back out in Vegas, symbolic of the top scholar athlete in college football. So you can see he's the total package. And he's flanked by 2 outstanding linebackers, Seth Benson, kid out of Sioux Falls, who was the last scholarship offer for Kirk Ferentz in that particular class 4 or 5 years ago. Seth's blossomed into an all Big Ten linebacker. He's had 100 or more tackles the last couple of years. They have a kid on the other side, Jay Higgins, a big 235-pound junior who can really run, who cut his teeth on special teams. He was a star on special teams. He's really got a nose for the football. In the secondary, they've got Riley Moss at one corner, who's an All-American. Now, Kayvon Merriweather, who's an All-Big Ten safety, All-American. He declared early for the draft, so they've got a hole to fill there. On the other side, they've got an incredible first-year starter in Cooper DeJean. Remember that name. He is from small-town Iowa. He played seemingly every sport known to mankind and excelled at all of them. He's kind of a Jack Armstrong, the All-American boy type. Up front, they rotate 8 guys, all good. I mean, all 6'5". They're all in that 280 to 290 pound range, and they get after the quarterback. But they don't blitz a lot. They're a base 4-3 team. They figure that over 4 quarters, Iowa's physicality will get to you, and they make you drive the field 10, 11, 12 play drives, which is good for the offense, but it also plays into Iowa's hands because their MO is if we make you drive the ball 70, 80 yards, if that happens, then you're apt to make a mistake in one of those 15 plays, and that's where they get you. And Iowa, up until that Nebraska game where it was just a disaster from the get-go that day, the Hawkeyes were like plus 7 or 8 in turnovers. They turned the ball over 4 times that day. It was just was not their day, and credit Nebraska. So I think between the defense and an All-American punter in Torrey Taylor, who was just magnificent all year long, deadening punts inside, not only inside the 20, but inside of the 10. Over half of his 50-55 punts died inside the opponent's 20-yard line. So when you give the Iowa defense that kind of field position plus, usually good things are going to happen. So I do think, and I know Kentucky's defense is outstanding, I do think it'll come down to defense and a couple turnovers here or there.
Last question I have for the Music City Bowl, and I've got a couple fun questions for you, but I want to ask about the excitement levels and the energy levels around the Iowa Hawkeyes fan base heading into the TransPerfect Music City Bowl, and just talk about that. What are you hearing from Iowa fans?
Well, of course, we just came off the recruit signing period, and they're fired up about the 24 or 5 young men Iowa signed, along with a handful of walk-ons. And Iowa's program, not unlike Kentucky's, depends on quality walk-ons. Of course, the fan base is really upset now because Alabama came in and stole Caden Proctor, the number 1 ranked offensive tackle in the country, not just in Iowa, a big kid out of the Des Moines area. And he flipped with 48 hours to go to Alabama. His coach parents would say, hey, it wasn't a bad choice. And so Alabama's got a pretty good reputation last time I checked for college football. So that's occupying the fanatics on social media right now. I really don't pay a lot of attention to recruiting. I just don't have the time. But I do know that Caden, they get Tristan Wirfs with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Caden, although he's a left tackle, is very similar in size and nastiness to Tristan Wirfs. Other guys like Riley Reif and Robert Gallery and Eric Steinbach, all those, Brian Bulaga. He's got that same kind of mentality as those number 1 draft picks that Iowa has produced for the NFL down through the years. But as for the Music City Bowl, Iowa fans are fired up. If for no other reason, it's an easy drive. I mean, from anywhere in the state, you get on I-80 or I-35, you want to go north or south, and then cut over through Memphis, you can do that. But most of our fan base will take 80 right over to 65 and then motor on down. It's an easy drive. I mean, it's 7 or 8 hours on average, but that's a pretty easy drive for Iowa fans. When you live in basically a rural state, an ag-based state like Iowa, you're used to driving all over the place, whether it's in your car or on your tractor. So they're fired up. We were almost there a couple of years ago, Mitch, if you remember. The Hawks were scheduled to play Missouri, and Mizzou had to back out a week or so out. Of course, that was the COVID year, and they had a dozen players racked with COVID, and therefore they postponed or canceled the game altogether. So Iowa's had a hunger. They've never been to the Music City Bowl. Nashville obviously speaks for itself. It's a great city, and Iowa fans like to party when they're on the road. So I look for party times too in Nashville with the Hawkeye fan base.
I will say I look forward to partying with those Iowa fans. I've heard a lot of great things. I was not at the Citrus Bowl last year, but a lot of my friends and family were, and they said the Iowa fans were tremendous people. So jumping over to a couple personal questions, just some fun questions for both fan bases to get to know you. Obviously, you've been around a long time, but looking at when you started this and when you got into this business, who were 1 or 2 of those role models in the broadcasting business that you looked up to?
Yeah, boy, it's hard to zero in on 1 or 2. I'll tell you this, and I get asked that question a lot by journalism students, and they've never heard of the guys I'm going to mention, but I tell them to Google, first off, Lindsey Nelson. Lindsey Nelson, I don't know how old you are, but when I look forward to jumping out of bed on New Year's morning, because major bowls televised. Of course, I was a huge college football fan growing up. My folks were season ticket holders to Iowa. I grew up 60 miles from Iowa City, and there was nothing better than sitting in Kinnick Stadium on a Saturday afternoon watching your beloved Hawks, even though they weren't very good then. But to answer your question, Lindsey Nelson was always the first guy I'd see on TV because he did the Cotton Bowl every year. And Lindsey, at the time, was the voice of the New York Mets. And he also did Notre Dame football back when they would tape the TV show and replay it on Sunday night. Most schools did that. Very few did it live or, on set. And Lindsey had that distinctive voice. And not only was he a great radio play-by-play announcer, but he was fabulous on TV. And he would do the Cotton Bowl every year. He did a number of national championship games. I think of Texas and Notre Dame when Joe Montana was the quarterback of the Irish. He did that game. And it's just a phenomenal voice to wake up to on New Year's morning. And the Cotton Bowl, as you know, always kicked off first, right around 10:30, 11 o'clock. And then you would roll into the Rose Bowl that afternoon, and then, of course, in the evening, the Sugar Bowl and Orange Bowl. So there's so many great announcers that are former radio announcers. Pat Summerall is another all-time favorite of mine. Pat and Ray Scott, who did the Packers for a lot of years, they knew exactly where to put in the grammatical pause. What I loved about those guys and guys of their generation is they didn't feel they had to fill up the broadcast with nonstop verbiage. They would stop. I mean, I'm a huge crowd noise guy. I love to just pause and let the crowd noise get people excited as they're driving down their country road or their interstate highway, because who doesn't get fired up when your team scores before a sold-out house? And crowd noise is big a factor as anything you could add to it. And whether it's a game-winning kick or a one-sided win, as the game ticks down to 0 at the end, the crowd noise rises to a crescendo. And part of that is when I grew up in the 60s, when my parents gave me that spin dial RCA radio, a little handheld radio in the 60s, I found it fascinating that I could lay in bed at night and you just turn that dial a quarter of an inch and you'd land on another great play-by-play announcer, primarily Major League Baseball. And, of course, living in Iowa, we had have a lot of great 50,000 watt stations around the Midwest, some you're very familiar with, like KMOX in St. Louis, WCCO in Minneapolis, WGN in Chicago, WJR in Detroit. Ernie Harwell was one of the first great voices I've heard. But I could bring in Pittsburgh and I could bring in Philadelphia late at night and hear all these incredible announcers, Jack Buck, Herb Carneal with the Twins, Bob Elson and Jack Brickhouse in Chicago with the White Sox and the Cubs. And that's where I really fell in love with radio as a 10-year-old. I thought, man, how great would that be to sit behind the microphone and broadcast Mickey Mantle hitting one out of the ballpark, or Ted Williams or DiMaggio lining one off the left field wall, or I had the pleasure of interviewing Mickey Mantle one time, and he grew up in Commerce, Oklahoma, not too far from where you are. And I said, who was your favorite player growing up? He said, well, we could only get one radio station. That was KMOX in St. Louis. So naturally, Stan the Man Musial was Mickey Mantle's favorite growing up. So it's just, it's amazing the effect that baseball announcers in particular, but play-by-play announcers have had on the listening public or the viewing public over the years, whether it's radio or TV. And many, many Hall of Famers have transcended both. They've tied the two together. And I get it. It's a different world now with social media. That it's not just radio and television. But I still enjoy going out to the mailbox every morning, grabbing the paper, getting it in my hands with a cup of coffee, and going from page 1 to page 35. So call me old school, but those are some of the names I grew up with.
I will say before I ask you this last question, I grew up with listening to John Lord, Larry Munson, Kaywood Ledford, Jack Crystal at Mississippi State, and those are the guys, are the reasons. Lindsey Nelson's another one that I heard folklore about. Those are the reasons why I got into podcasting and writing articles, is because as a kid, even though I never heard them live, my dad would play, old Larry Munson and old Jack Crystal, wrapping in maroon and white, And that's how I grew up. And, getting to interview play-by-play guys from around the country is just such an honor. And this last question is going to be a fun question for you, but I want to ask you, it's a two-parter. What does the University of Iowa mean to you personally and your family? And also, when it's all said and done, you retire, you step away from the broadcasting booth, what would you like to be remembered in your legacy to be at Iowa?
Okay, well, let's go first with what does the University of Iowa mean to me? I grew up in a family of 7 kids, and my dad ran a little corner store in a town of about 1,200 people. So we were a C-store long before they called them convenience stores, and he would have baseball pools almost weekly. He was a great Yankee fan. That's where I fell in love with Mickey Mantle, and he would have bus trips to Chicago every year. To see the White Sox and the Yankees in a doubleheader at Old Comiskey Park, or he would host bus trips to Iowa City to see Iowa Notre Dame, or the Hawkeyes and the University of Wyoming, and I'd be on that bus, first one lined up. My brother, there were 4 boys and 3 girls in our family, and the brothers usually got to go to every game, and we'd hustle up to the knothole and pay $2 for a ticket to sit in the end zone. That's what I'll always. That's what will always endear me to Iowa athletics. And of course, now you've got the $1 million suites and the comfy indoor-outdoor club seats, and so it's a different era now. But that's what I'll remember about first falling in love with Hawkeye football. Now, I'm not old enough to remember Niall Kinnick or some of the great players in the 50s that Evashevsky had when he won 3 Big Ten championships or 3 Rose Bowls, whatever it was. But that's where I fell in love with Iowa football. Growing up an hour and 15 minutes from the stadium, everything, at least in the eastern part of the state, revolves around Iowa. Because other than the AAA franchise of the Iowa Cubs and a couple of Class A franchises in the state, Iowa doesn't have the Green Bay Packers. They don't have the St. Louis Cardinals. They don't have the New York Rangers. It's all about the University of Iowa. That is our professional team, if you will. And so, even though Iowa State has really come on here the past few years under Coach Campbell, to me it'll always be a Hawkeye State. So that it's kind of family based, and of course everybody in the eastern part of the state, where most of the population is, grew up rabid Hawkeye fans. And then when I do retire, and that's not, I'm starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel there, Mitch. But when I do retire, I hope people remember me for honesty on the air. Call me a throwback, but I've gotten in a tussle on the air for some things that I've said that certainly were open and honest and meant nothing more than to compliment the athlete. But in this world that we live in now, you've got to be careful what you say. But yet I want to be honest and fair, and I've always been one to first give credit to the opponent should the Hawkeyes lose, because obviously they're on scholarship. So essentially, indirectly, they're getting paid to win football or basketball games too. The Hawkeyes basketball team just upset by Eastern Illinois a few days ago. The Hawkeyes were a 31-point favorite. Yeah, they're missing Chris Murray and they're missing Connor McCaffrey, but you know what? Give the other kids credit, as painful as that loss was. You give the opponent credit. Be a crowd noise guy. Let the crowd in the front door of your radio broadcast, and just try and be fair and be honest. Lord knows I make enough mistakes during the game, whether I'm trying to memorize a name with a number. But I think our fan base in Iowa, as you know, is a great radio state. It's an agricultural state, so whether the farmers are in the field or folks are in their driveway washing their car, the Hawkeye Radio Network, 55 stations strong with a couple of 50,000 watts out there. They get into 40 states at night. It's a passion for Iowa fans. We're still a radio state. That's what I'll always treasure. I know most everybody's out there listening. So try and do your best, and that's all I can ask for.
Gary, thank you so much for coming on the Mitch Davis Show. It's been an honor. Merry Christmas to yours and your family, and I look forward to meeting you in Nashville next week.
Likewise, Mitch. Happy holidays to all your listeners and viewers, and go Hawks, go Wildcats. It should be another close game in the Music City. You guys have a great New Year.
You have been listening to The Mitch Davis Show. I've been your host, Mitch Davis, founder of the MitchDavisShow.com, podcast host of The Mitch Davis Show, co-host of the Hit It to Hoover SEC Baseball podcast with Jake Nichols. You can follow me on Twitter, MitchDavis_8. I'm going to be in Nashville next weekend, boots on the ground, as they say, covering and bringing you, the fans, an in-depth look into the 2022 Trans-Perfect Music City Bowl matchup between the Kentucky Wildcats and the Iowa Hawkeyes. Thank you again for listening to The Mitch Davis Show. Merry Christmas and enjoy the holiday season. Thank you.